There is a ton of money to be made playing daily fantasy tennis because the field simply does not know what it takes to beat this sport. My name's Jordan Chand, I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and in this video, I'm going to be giving you the keys you need to know to crush Tennis DFS this season. But before we get started, if you enjoy this video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get a notification every time we post a new one. And for this video, I'm going to be focusing on the highlights here. If you're interested in a deep dive into Tennis DFS strategy, check out the video on our YouTube channel called Learn Tennis DFS from the Experts, which is also posted in the description of this video. But for now, let's go ahead and just jump right in. The first key to beating Tennis DFS is understanding the range of outcomes. Average projections and traditional optimizers that optimize for the highest average projected lineups aren't that helpful in DFS, period, but especially not in tennis. Tennis is a binary sport where every player on the slate is either going to win or lose their match, and average projections split the difference essentially between the player winning and losing their match, but players don't actually score their average that often. You can see here for Riley Opelka's distributions from our simulations, his average projection of 47.42 points isn't really that descriptive, or it doesn't really tell the whole story about what his outcomes actually look like. But even more so, you don't want an average outcome to beat GPPs, you want upside, which means the most important thing to do is figure out how often the player is going to win and how many points they score when they do. So if you're using average projections, you're left optimizing for an outcome that isn't very likely or descriptive of the whole range of outcomes and isn't even the outcome you want. To get true upside in your lineups, you need a way to visualize and understand the full range of outcomes for each player on the slate, and the best way to do this is by simulating out the matches. SaberSim simulates every match on the slate point by point thousands of times, which lets us come up with these full ranges of outcomes for each match on the slate. And when we build your lineups on SaberSim, we don't use the average projections. We use single simulations or single sets of simulations from our sims and build lineups based on what those players scored in those actual simulations. So your lineups are optimized for upside, for the real outcomes of the way a match can play out, not the averages. The second key you need to know here is knowing the slate dynamics of that particular slate. Tennis is unique in that as the tournament goes along, the size of the slate is changing significantly from 30 matches or so early in the week to 8 or less matches later in the week. And this changes the optimal strategy considerably, and it's crucial to adjust accordingly. As there are fewer and fewer matches, ownership is going to condense on the best plays on that particular slate. And this means you get more leverage out of fading higher owned plays the smaller the slates get. For example, fading the chalk when they're 25% owned is great. When they fail, you're going to be ahead of 25% of the lineups in that pool. But fading the chalk when they are 60% owned is going to get you ahead of 60% of the lineups in the field when that player fails. But as the slate gets smaller, it also means there are less overall lineups that you can make, period, because there are so many less players in the pool. And it makes it more likely that the top lineups are going to be duplicated by others in the field. Being duplicated in DFS almost always lowers your expected value of your lineup because suddenly now you have to share the payout of wherever that lineup finishes. For example, if it's $100 to first and $50 to second, but your lineup is duplicated one time, your probability of taking first in that contest is still about the same. But now when you do it, you only take home $75 instead of $100 when you come in first. This means that it's very important to worry about duplication as the size of the slate gets smaller and there are less lineups that you can make. Now, the best way to deal with both of these strategic considerations here is to favor more low-owned players as the slate gets smaller, even if those players are more potentially risky or bigger underdogs in their match. In SaberSim, my favorite way to do this is to turn up the ownership fade slider as the size of the slate gets smaller, which will take into account ownership as it's building your lineups. In a big slate with 20 or 30 matches, a low ownership fade will probably work, somewhere between 0 and 2 out of 10. But as the slate gets much smaller, down to especially something like less than 10 matches, you might want to think about raising the ownership fade slider to moderate or even high level, somewhere between 4 to 6 out of 10. But the second thing that's important about knowing that particular slate is the Vegas odds. Almost all tennis projection models are going to rely pretty heavily on Vegas money lines to estimate the probability of a player winning the match. And Vegas money lines are pretty good overall, but they are not perfect. And especially for smaller tournaments where the Vegas market is less liquid overall, these lines may not be very efficient. Researching the matches on a slate to see if there are certain players or matches that have a greater percent chance to win their match or lose their match than Vegas is implying is a great way to add value and get better tennis DFS lineups. And on SaberSim, you can do this by easily just adjusting the player projections before you build your lineups. If you want to adjust a player, I'd recommend adjusting that player up or down by 10% of their original mean projection and run another build and see how things are looking after that. But don't forget to adjust the opponent's projection as well. Since a match in tennis is zero sum, one player has to lose, one player has to win. If you're bumping one player up, you should be bumping the other player down accordingly. And if you're right, this is going to have a huge impact to your expected value because you'll have better and more accurate information than virtually a huge majority of the field because so many models are relying on Vegas so heavily. The third thing to note here is to manage your risk. Tennis is a high variance DFS sport, and even some of the heaviest favorites on a slate are still going to have a pretty real chance of losing their match. You can see here on Andy Murray's distributions for this slate, he's clearly a favorite. Most of his outcomes are going to be when he wins the match, but there's a legitimate risk of him losing and a big set of different outcomes where he does lose that match. You should be comfortable with the downside of one of your more highly exposed players potentially losing their match in your portfolio. There are a lot of different profitable lineups that you can make, especially on the larger slates. And by spreading out your exposure, you can typically maintain a high expected value across your entire lineup portfolio, but limit your downside when one particular player loses. Different DFS players are going to have different risk tolerances or risk aversion, but every tennis DFS player should at least be conscious of the risk that they're taking on with the exposures in their portfolio. And in SaberSim, this is really easy. When you build lineups with SaberSim, we're not just going to build the exact number of lineups that you need to actually enter into your contests, but we build a big pool of additional lineups that are viable for the contest so you can make adjustments to those exposures until you're comfortable with the overall risk associated with your portfolio. My favorite way to do this is to compare my exposure to any given player to their overall win probability and to the projected ownership of that player to basically make sure that there isn't a situation where I am far more exposed to any one player than the field or that player's raw probability of winning the match. Now, I want to actually run through a build for today's Wimbledon slate and talk through how I actually apply these concepts at each step in the process. So on the first part here, I'll be doing a little bit of research on most of the matches on a slate, depending on how much time I have, just to see if there's anything that I disagree with how Vegas is projecting the slate. And one of the names that caught my eye for this particular slate today was the Krejcikova versus Golubic match here. Right now, Krejcikova has a 62% chance to win according to Vegas. And I think I find that a little bit odd. I think this is a little bit closer to maybe even a pick'em here based on my particular research. Golubic has a much better history and much more experience playing on grass courts, and Krejcikova struggled significantly in her first match in the first round. So I'm going to go ahead and just make an adjustment here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bump down Krejcikova by 10% of her projection to 45 points. And I'm going to make sure that I also find Golubic here and bump up her projection up another 4 points or so as well. Maybe actually another point there as well. Again, because as one player has a better chance to win, the other player has a better chance to lose compared to Vegas. And obviously, I would go through and do this for as many matches as I had an opinion on and had time to research. But for now, I'm going to just leave it at that. Now I'm going to go ahead and click Build Lineups here, and I'm going to build for a 150 max. I'm going to build for the big contest for today. And since, we're not getting to the really small slates at the end of the tournament here, but in the second round now, there are fewer matches. I want to start taking into account ownership a little bit more to get some ownership leverage and to avoid getting duplicated here at this particular point. And we can see by default, the ownership fade slider is 0. It's neutral. We're not taking into account ownership at all. I'm going to bump that up to around 2 here. Again, not super concerned yet with ownership and duplication just yet, but I do want it to be a factor. Now I'm going to go ahead and click Start New Build. And remember, one of the things that makes SaberSim unique here is we're taking into account those simulations and the full range of outcomes of each match automatically as we build those lineups. So all of these lineups that I'm building are going to be optimized for a set of simulations for the way that the actual slate could actually play out. So as we get here into the post-build process, I'm looking for 150 lineups, and I have a pool of 500 lineups from which to work with and to adjust exposures and to manage my risk. And one thing that jumps out immediately here is we're getting a lot of Golobic here, our most exposed player on the slate, our highest leverage player, and we're quite a bit higher than the projected ownership here. And I think that's mostly okay. I think this is an opportunity to get a little bit of an edge on the slate, but I don't know if I want to go that high. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull back the win odds here. And I'm going to look for a couple things. So first of all, I want to make sure that I don't have any significant outliers in my exposure relative to the win odds, and particularly on underdogs. If I think this is maybe closer to like a 55-45 type match on the slate, I'm going to bring down my exposure here to 45% and just bring that down a little bit more so I'm not so all in on just this one match. I'm going to go ahead and look at the other underdogs that I'm getting exposure to and see if there's any other significant outliers compared to that player's chance of winning the match and my overall exposure here. And it doesn't really look like there is. The last thing I'm going to do is compare my leverage. The leverage is going to be my exposure minus the projected ownership for a particular player, and I'm looking for outliers here. So the only real outlier it looks like I'm seeing, again, is Golobic here. I think I'm actually going to bring this down to about 40% there, and it is still, my greatest stand here on this particular slate, but I just want to make sure that I'm not overexposed to the potential downside situation if she loses the match anyway. Once I've dialed this in and I'm happy with the risk associated with my exposure to all of these different players, I'm good to go and my build is complete. Now let's review. Understand the real ranges of outcomes of each match on the slate, and in particular, be careful of average projections that don't understand the true upside of each player. Second, know the slate dynamics and what makes that slate unique. How is the size of the slate affecting the optimal strategy as it relates to ownership and duplication? And are there any opportunities where Vegas money lines are missing something or are inefficient that you can take advantage of? And third, manage your risk. Avoid significant downside when one player in their match loses, and spread out your exposures where possible. SaberSim is the best tool on the market to build better tennis DFS lineups because there's no tool out there that makes incorporating these 3 keys into your tennis DFS strategy easier. You can get signed up for a free trial today on our site, SaberSim.com, and not only get access to our tennis simulations and tennis lineup builder, but all of our other sports as well. In the meantime, thanks for watching and good luck.